welcome you along with Town of Rhinebeck historian Nancy Kelly. So, clap for Nancy. And we're very sorry to say that Beverly Kane could not be here tonight, but she contributed tremendous amounts of research along with our town historian here to this presentation. I just, got two incredibly salacious stories to share with you all. So we're going to go through a brief slideshow tonight detailing tales from Prohibition era Rhinebeck. And the series, of course, in general is focusing on two key themes, one of which is Prohibition, which we've heard tons and tons about from Boardwalk Empire to Eliot Ness. But we'll also have some events in the regular series, which runs all the way through till October, on temperance. Temperance, of course, has a history that goes far back into the 19th century. It's what led to Prohibition in the first place. And it'll also provide us with an opportunity to discuss why Prohibition of alcohol sales was passed, because there was a long lead up to it and also a series of social ills blamed, rightly or wrongly, on alcohol. And we'll learn about that all through the series. And I'm glad to point out that our next event is going to be on May 12th out at Old Drover's Inn in Dover. And we have some of our hosts from the Dover Historical Society up here in Center. I'm sure they'll take some notes tonight for their own presentation. And we'll be ending in October with Duchess Spirits. And of course, we have the executive director of Duchess Spirits, Lydia Higginson, with us. Bathrooms, if you need them, are along the very back wall. And your tickets that you should have gotten when you signed up today are good for 10% off your meal tonight. So at this point, are there any questions? Seeing none, I'm going to turn Nancy's speaker on because she's not quite as loud as I am. So, Nancy, say hello to the folks. Let's do a little sound check.
Hello, everyone.
Can you hear Nancy?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, Nancy, take it away.
Okay. We are very pleased to have you here in Rhinebeck, and it was exciting to try to get together some information for you. It's not the kind of thing that is in my Rhinebeck historian's records. And of course, I'd heard some stories over the years, but actually, although I grew up in Rhinebeck, my family was more or less teetotalers. And my grandmother was widowed when my mother was 10 years old, and my grandmother was very busy just taking care of the farm and two little children that she had to care for. And so they didn't get much involved with any of the Prohibition activities. So when we're talking about Prohibition-related things, we thought so often about the end of Mill Road included at Linwood this residence, which was Jacob Rupert, and he was a big beer baron, and his family had come to the U.S. and started a brewery, and then Jacob took it over, and from there his son Jacob took it over, and finally his nephew took it over. So they lived at Linwood, and they attracted others to that area, so there were at least three what we called beer barons that lived down at the end of Mill Road. And this Wincliffe mansion is the one that they've been talking about having to tear down because it's in such horrendous ruins now. But at the time, it was called Linden Grove or Fink's Castle, and Andrew Fink, who lived there, had a brewery in New York City as well. And so they say that he manufactured beer barrels and that he probably brewed ale during the Prohibition, perhaps at Wincliffe. But the most interesting thing there is that they had a tennis court down from the mansion toward the river, and they somehow had piped beer to the tennis court. So you had a tap at the tennis court to allow you to have some beer. The next place that was, yes, and it was interesting that here is a brochure about Linden Hall as a restaurant, so that it must be that for a while they were actually taking guests and serving, and I would think that this was during the Prohibition time period. So
That's Rhinecliff.
that's in Rhinecliff.
Is it next to the Rhinecliff Hotel?
No, well, not, Mill Road is not actually Rhinecliff. It is heading toward the river, but it goes from the south part of
direction.
Rhinebeck
Okay.
and
If-
toward.
If you know where Wilderstein is,
Yes.
it's a little bit further
Further than
down the
that.
road from
Okay.
Wilderstein.
Okay, thank you.
And also on this road, on the next one, is this house. And it was called Whispering Pine, but also I think it had a linden name to do with it too. And here Conrad Stein lived there. What I've read recently seems to seem that he was a real estate dealer. So whether he was a beer baron or whether there was an earlier beer baron who lived in that house, but those are the three houses that are connected with that. Now, we did do all this research and got newspaper articles and things, and I know you can't read all the information that's projected on the screen, but this is try and give you a little idea of what the news was like and what our local newspaper was like at the time. So we're starting back in 1917, and they apparently had a board of commissioners, and they were to consider the different saloons and see which ones should be allowed to stay open in 1917. And while they were making these decisions, Henry Mank, who had a place on West Market Street, said that he was going to be closing his saloon. And then here, a week later, he said he'd like to continue. And so those two articles came to light. And then the next thing was in 1918, a month later, it's saying that they're going to close the Beekman Arms bar. It's saying, okay, here's the Beekman Arms bar as they had it pictured in a glass negative at the time. It's saying that they're going to discontinue the Liberty Montgomery saloon, and down at the bottom, it's talking about Paris fashions, and the women's skirts must be shorter and narrower, and they say, oh boy. So this it was a feature of the Gazette each week called Gleanings by the Office Cat, and we'll show you a couple of other kinds of things like that too. I guess the one just before this was listing the different saloons that they were. So over here on the right, they had listed Wallace Foster at the hotel, Walter Decker on Montgomery Street, the Liberty Montgomery on East Market Street near Mill. So that must be somewhere like maybe where the Petit Bistro is now. Then in Rhinecliff, we have quite a few. So there's the Leary Saloon in Rhinecliff, James Bryce in Rhinecliff, Benson and Rhinecliff, and then they're investigating about William Scott and Henry Mank, Reuben Loft, and Joseph Keegan. So that was all the kinds of things that were going on in 1917.
How long did Prohibition last? I don't remember exactly. the dates.
Well, as far as I can figure out, it was about from 1917, toward the end of 1917, until 1934.
Officially, the 20th Amendment passed in 1990, the 18th Amendment passed in 1919, and it was more or less not enforced after 1932. So 32 was the last big year of raids.
It's still a long time.
It is.
Next thing that we had was a grocery store, and someone who was in her 90s told me that mostly all the grocery stores, drugstores and so on in town were likely to have the food up front and liquor in the back or down in the basement, so that if you knew the right questions to ask, you got the right the right service. But this is a picture of a grocery store on East Market Street during that time period. Then let's look at this next optimistic report. There's only one saloon left in Rhinebeck, and this is October of 1918. And we're glad to know that the non-use of liquor in Rhinebeck is increasing in a normal and healthy way. So then we get to 1921, and we're starting to read about raids and things. And here the sheriff had come to Rhinebeck. And actually, what he did was, he went to Harder's saloon, which was on West Market Street, and I can still remember Harder's saloon being there. Right now it's called Market Street Restaurant. And he found 2 barrels of cider in the cellar, and so they knocked the end out of the barrel, and that was the end of that cider. And he didn't arrest anybody, he just knocked the barrel out. And then he visited someplace on Montgomery Street and disposed of some cider as well. He visited Adam von der Linden's ice cream parlor on East Market Street. Might be somewhere near where that other saloon was. And found Nerve Tonic, known as Vino, which apparently had quite a bit of alcohol in it, and so that was confiscated. And they didn't arrest anybody. They just took what they wanted and went on their way. And that was a sheriff's raid. The next thing was a list here of all the different types of things to drink that had alcohol in them. And you were allowed a half of 1% alcohol you were allowed to sell. But something more than that was against the law. Now you could drink it, and it wasn't against the law for you to drink it. It was just against the law for them to sell it to you. And so there was all kinds of cider and beer of different alcoholic content, and all kinds of ways of getting around this. But they had a good time with that.
You know, what you may not see from where you're sitting is that this list of all of the patent medicines and whatnot tells you exactly how much liquor alcohol is in it. So, for example, Vino Tonic out of Newark, New Jersey, had 21.19% alcohol content in it, as opposed to the 0.5% that is theoretically allowed. So there was a lot of use of patent medicines as a delivery system for alcohol in a semi-legal fashion.
Down close to the bottom where it's hard to read, it does say Rupert's Metropolitan, 0.2%. That was being produced, I guess. And then in the Gazette, we read quite a bit from Burton Coon. He would like to put a article in every week, and he was a farmer from Red Hook. He kept diaries that were very interesting. I think they have them all at the Elmendorf in Red Hook. And he was a good observer of things, and what they did was collected all his articles and published them in a book form, so that at the Elmendorf you can buy a copy of his remembrances. And that's kind of nice. Anyway, here he's got this article, and he thinks that he had watched different people who were overextending themselves with what they were drinking, and he thinks that those who sold them the liquor were the real transgressors and not those that were imbibing. And so so it's interesting to see what he had to say. Now we get to Benson Astor.
But before we get to Astor, it's my turn to give you a slight salacious story. So whereas Nancy and Beverly went through the local paper, the Rhinebeck Gazette, I took a look through the Poughkeepsie Journal, which of course is the county-wide newspaper still published today. And we have this article that's published on Tuesday, January 10th, 1922. It actually details something that happened the previous afternoon. So, two fellows were driving an Owen magnetic touring car, which is a really fancy name for a small van, down probably Route 9, and just north of Rhinebeck here, they had a flat tire. So far, so good. So while they're out changing the tire, two state troopers drive down, ask if they can render assistance, and notice that you have two men who are obviously not from Dutchess County with a rather large vehicle that they're repairing. So the troopers, who are described in the article as being very experienced in this, start going through the car, and what they find, the quote is worth hearing in its entirety. The rear and front seats of the automobile had been especially constructed to transport the supply of liquor. They found 400 bottles of whiskey in this car. There was a false cushion on the rear seat under which the quart bottles of whiskey were packed. The bottles were also stored underneath the front seat and under the floorboards. And the troopers, the two of them who went through this and who had considerable experience, said the liquor was packed away in about as skillful a manner as they had ever seen. So even fairly early on in Prohibition, you have this specialist rum running, as it were. Although in this case, the cargo consisted of bottles of the White Horse whiskey, which you see here, and then Jockey Club whiskey, as well as gin and Canadian beer. And both of the men were from New York City, named Frank Inch and Joseph Feeney. And in addition to the 400 bottles of liquor, which they bought at about $4 to $5 per bottle and were planning to sell in New York City for $10 and more per bottle, they found a .25 caliber handgun with apparently plenty of ammunition, but neither of the men would admit that they owned it. They're just like,
Where'd that come from?
that just came into the car and I didn't even see it there, officers. So these two men were immediately brought before the local justice of the peace, arraigned, and then sent down to Poughkeepsie. Both the vehicle, the gun and ammunition, and all of the liquor were impounded by the sheriff. So as we see here, Dutchess County was already a pretty established conduit for this alcohol that was flowing down, probably from Canada, where it could be easily bought. So, what did they do with it when they impounded it? I think that Nancy actually has some insights on this from a few newspaper articles further on, but apparently not all of this evidence survived to make it to the trial. So Nancy, back to you.
Thank you.
I know a great-grandmother that was related to my husband. She used to work for Sears. And she did all the sewing and upholstery work. She used to sew all the liquor into the upholstery of the cars.
Wow. We aren't told in here what happened after they were arraigned, but we have at least one later case where a fellow was sentenced to jail for 45 days for serving alcohol. So folks like this, if they're tried in the county system, they're probably going to get a less severe sentence than if the federals get their hands on it. So judging by the later article that I'll discuss further on in the presentation, it looks like they were giving out about 3-month sentences in county jail for this sort of thing. Which, you know, no cable TV at that point in time. It wasn't a nice place to be for 3 months.
I wanted to mention about the Astors. The Astors were very important to Rhinebeck's history. And John Jacob Astor, of course, died in 1912 before this Prohibition. But they say that in the early 20s, Vincent sold the hotels that they had in New York City, that they had 4 hotels, and he sold them, and that included the St. Regis. I didn't get all the names of the hotel at Waldorf and like that. So then he was also downsizing to get away from the area where the Astors had originally their mansion, and built a smaller townhouse on East 80th Street. Then we'll get to what happened at the end of Prohibition with Vincent a little later in our story. I go on this Friends of Old Rhinebeck and on Facebook. I don't know if any of you have Facebook connections when you are doing Facebook. This particular site is quite focused on history, and so I asked if anybody had any stories about Prohibition, and 2 people responded, and the one talked about his Uncle Pike having made hard cider, and I think that was pretty true, that there were many individuals around that made hard cider, because we had plenty of apple orchards in the area and lots of opportunity to do that. But the Indian families in Lafayetteville made dandelion wine, and of course that was a very popular drink too, so that I'm sure that the wine was made not only for their own consumption but for sale as well. And then talking about Rhinecliff, grandfather talked about bathtub gin being made in Rhinecliff that was then transported to New York City. Well, if we look a little closer, we find that, okay. The raid that we had at Benson's in Rhinecliff, where they someone had purchased the intoxicants and then arrested the beer owner, and they had liquor, Applejack, homebrew, and cider. And Benson was held in $1,000 bail for his appearance in New York. So that happened then, and then we had.
Do the next one.
This house here. Now, this Dutch Schultz Dutch Schultz was by the railroad out in Pine Plains, and his produce came over toward the river on Connecticut and Rhinebeck Railroad. And this house was near there. This house is at the end of Long Dock Road, down by the river. We call it the Jacob Kip House. And the owners of that house had always heard the story that Dutch Schultz stored liquor here and shipped it to New York. So that's our connection with rum running, bootlegging.
Then we've got my second story for you. So you asked what were the punishments that were associated with breaking Prohibition law one way or another. So here we have a local fellow named Herman Best. He's in his 60s, and it's 1930. And Herman Best, it's June 12th, a Thursday. He's had a bad week because this is the second time he's been arrested in 3 days. So on Monday of this week, he's arrested by local sheriffs, Dutchess County sheriffs, because he's found to be driving in an erratic and dangerous manner. They don't really spell out in the newspaper article here, was he drunk behind the wheel, was he not? But then he's arrested on Wednesday for being drunk and disorderly. And what comes out in the course of his trial, he's brought before the local justice of the peace, is that being a disorderly person in this case means running basically what one might call a cat house or a bawdy house over on Württemberg Road, which is off modern Route 9G in the old hamlet of Württemberg. And they make it very clear in this article that they're not going after him for prohibition issue. They're going after him for maintaining a resort for drunkards and tipplers. And they specifically say, actually, that the primary purpose of the prosecution was, and I quote, to clean up an evil that exists in the town of Rhinebeck, an evil conducted by this man. It is not up to us to judge the merits of prohibition. This is simply a prosecution of a man we believe to be a disorderly person under our statutes. And they actually prosecuted him not for breaking the 18th Amendment, but for breaking an 1854 law passed in Dutchess County, only for Dutchess County, for running a disorderly house. And they state in here that the normal sentence would be 3 months in Dutchess County jail, but because of his advanced age and because he had promised and his wife had promised to shut down their house, not to serve liquor or entertain these awful people anymore, they'd knock it back to 45 days. But if his wife didn't shut down the house, they'd slap him with the full sentence. And apparently 100 people attended the trial, but left disappointed because they did not receive the startling disclosures that had been promised to them initially. So all kinds of things going on, even pretty late in Prohibition. Is the law still on the books as far as I know? Yes. So don't run a disorderly house in Dutchess County. You don't want to spend 45 days in the county lockup.
Now, I have not been able to locate a historic picture of the Germond house, but I remember seeing pictures, and it was located right here on the other side of the bank, the M&T Bank, and was moved to this location for the Delamater house. But the Germond house, the story always was that they had a speakeasy in the basement. And so at that, where it was located over here, there was quite a high front porch. And you were to walk around and underneath the porch and into the basement. And you knock on the door with a certain type of knock, and then you were be allowed in. And so that was a story that I can't substantiate, but that's one rumor that had been in town.
Although we've also heard that when they moved the Germond house to its current location, they uncovered a big pile of empty bottles in the foundation area. So provide some extra fodder there for the imagination.
this was some kind of a, sort of an ad that was put in the paper by beer makers, and was saying that it was very easy to distill liquor and do that in small quantities, but that if you were going to brew beer, it was a more involved situation. And that it wasn't any crime to drink alcoholic beverages, it was a crime to sell them. And so they were talking about it was a mistake to be abolishing the saloons, and that the beer was okay.
And remember, Prohibition was prohibition of the sale of alcohol. It did not prohibit consumption of alcohol, nor did it actually prohibit making alcohol for your own consumption. So even while they are coming down hard on all of the rum runners and the folks who were brewing it like up at Dutch's Spirits for sale, you could still order through the Sears catalog at-home beer brewing kits and brew your own, consume your own, potentially at your own risk if you didn't do it properly. The same with wine and whatnot. It was just when you got to the point of making it and then selling it or buying it that you got into trouble with the law.
So you could make your own wine, and it's like Italians in New York used to make their own wine, my family.
Yeah.
Theoretically, I've had some homemade wine. I would not have it again. I did not agree with it.
Well, there were two little funny things in the paper. This one was about how pretzels were so popular, even though Prohibition was still in effect. And so I wonder what they were eating the pretzels with.
Yeah, the article up here reads, instead of ruining the pretzel industry as the Wets predicted when Prohibition placed a ban on beer, we've been consuming more of them every year since. Consumption last year was 8 million pounds more than 5 years ago. And the Wets, of course, that they were referring to were the folks who oppose Prohibition.
And then this section in the paper called Scissored Smiles and the Man About Town were always a part of the regular paper. And so he's talking about, the Man About Town says, wouldn't the crop of dandelions be welcome this year in Rhinebeck? And of course, we know what they'll do with the dandelions. And so I thought these kinds of a little humor in the paper. Now we've got the barn that burned.
Your pyrotechnics for the evening.
Yes. This was a house on Old Rock City Road, near Oriole Mills Road, where it comes out. And this farm and the house were located there. The house is no longer standing. It had a fire, I think, in 1980s, and they rebuilt it in the same spot, and it's very similar, but it's not the same house. And over to the right and quite a ways away was a very large barn. And that's the barn that burned. Now, go to the next page and we'll get the newspaper article. It was a spectacular blaze. Apparently, the still blew up and started the fire, and well, alcohol burned, and the flames went up so high that hundreds and hundreds of people came to watch. But it said that at the time the fire was discovered, they were using part of the barn to milk cows. Well, maybe it was the type of barn where the dairy was in the basement and the still was probably in the hayloft area on the top level, so that they were milking 5 cows and discovered that there was a fire. So they were able to get the cows out, but there was also a horse and about 50 chickens that were located in the barn, and they weren't able to save them. So that was a lot of excitement there.
You asked what happened to the evidence.
Now, in 1929, they're talking about, they were complaining about a speakeasy, so the troopers visited. And what happened was that they drank the evidence, so therefore there were no samples seized for analysis and nobody got arrested. I thought this was interesting because talking about seeking the repeal of Prohibition, and here are the names of a lot of river people doing their civic duty by being at some sort of a booth in Poughkeepsie. And so Miss Merritt had the estate that's closest to the bridge on River Road, Meadows. Tracy Dowes, of course, had the Fox Hollow estate, and Mrs. Johnson Livingston Redmond of Tivoli, Callender House up in Tivoli is a very well-known mansion, and then Mrs. Wing from Millbrook, and they have that Wing Castle in Millbrook. So those people were all busy working at the repeal of Prohibition. We found out that at Ferncliff they had a big celebration when Prohibition was repealed. They used to always invite everybody from town for the 4th of July celebration, and you'd have fireworks and refreshments and all at Ferncliff. But this time the party was for the repeal of Prohibition. So now we'll go back to the Rupert family, and this is Jacob Rupert Jr., and they had a picture, a postcard of him with Joe DiMaggio, and he was the owner of the Yankees. Now let me see. So he owned the Yankees from 1915 until 1939. He had Babe Ruth on the Yankees. He built the Yankee Stadium, and he had Joe DiMaggio for 13 years. There were 10 American League pennants that were won during the time Joe DiMaggio was there, and 9 World Series. So he was very proud of his team. Then his nephew eventually became the owner of this estate in Rhinebeck. He died in 1962, and Linwood now has become part of the Catholic Church, so that it is a mansion, but the original mansion that I showed you the picture earlier has been torn down, and they built a new facility for the nuns. And anybody ever hear of Herbert Hansen? Because they're Rupert Schalk and the Ruperts are supposed to have left a large part of their estate to this Herbert Hansen of Rhinebeck, who I've never heard of, and I don't know how it is that he inherited all this money from them. But the Knickerbocker beer, I'll do the next one yet. The Knickerbocker beer was very popular for quite a while, and they say that it was eventually sold to Rheingold in 1946. So that's our research on Prohibition in Rhinebeck, and I'm sure there's lots more to be discovered, but that's all we could find in this amount of time.
All right, thank you, Nancy. Does anybody have any questions?
How long was Rupert's Knickerbocker
Well, they started very early on, so I guess from like 1901 to the sale that
1917. And then after that, it was illegal to do any of the.
yeah, but you see, they have on the list that they were doing liquor, they were doing beer, so I think they were continuing even during the Prohibition.
Because Rhinebeck probably wasn't in business as long. I don't remember Rhinebeck was in business.
But the Knickerbocker beer, they were doing. Yeah.
I have 2 quick questions. This
Yeah.
is the longest running in America, right?
Yeah.
Theoretically.
I know, I thought, okay, I was gonna say, even though the saloon closed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then my other question is, you showed a beautiful Spanish-style home on River Road. Is that still standing?
Yes, it is.
Which one was that?
Well, they're called Whispering Pines, and had the Spanish tiles on the roof.
Stucco.
It was very unusual, unusual design for Rhinebeck.
And that's still there, but it's supposed to be, it's not in great shape. Is that the one?
Oh,
that you're
no, it's in beautiful shape. This is one that has a view down the river, and I don't know, some New Yorker owns it. Yeah. No, the one that's in bad shape was the one that the Sphinx had, and that was called Wincliffe, and Sphinx Castle, and other names.
So many of them up here. My gosh, I haven't seen those.
Yeah.
I think you're an assessor.
I'm sorry.
With a lot of notes.
All right, well, thank you all for joining us this evening. Remember, your tickets will get you 10% off
Thank you.
dinner here, and we hope that you'll join us on May 12th out at Old Drover's Inn in Dover.
Yeah.
Have a great evening.
And you're welcome to walk around through this way to view the top room.